So the curve has been built that we'll use for the loop snare. The circle that will extrude along the curve eventually to create the geometry for that loop snare is also there. Before I make the geometry, I'm going to create a IK handle that's going to control a rig that will control that loop snare polygon. So there's a lot of prep work here, in other words. So let's go into the lighting here. I'm going to use the default lighting, try to make things a little easier to see. And you can already see our joints X-ray. Before I lose this orientation, I'm going to create a curve that will fit inside my flexible portion of the endoscope and become the IK eventually for that loop. So I'm going to create curves again. I'm going to change this to a cubic curve, which is the default value. That gives it flexibility. Even though, quite honestly, it's going to be a straight line, I probably could almost leave it right as is, but I'm going to make it a curve. Now, what I like to do is have some more points here to let this curve again have the flexibility it's going to need to work with the rig that's controlling the whole flexible end of the tube. So these two things, the curve and the flexible end of the tube, have to coincide. So just to give myself, maybe give me a little more guides, I'm going to just increase the number of subdivisions. So now I can see I've got a lot more, maybe a little more than I need. Let's see if we go back to 12. That's a little better. There we go. So see how the number of subdivisions now is closer to the number of joints I have. So I'll take my create curve tool and I want to start right here. This is the this is the IK for the big scope, the majority of the scope. This is the IK handle for the end. So I'm going to start right about here, and I'll hold down the X key and just click basically wherever at a level where I see one of those joints, so that I have essentially the same, if you will, flexibility. Okay, now I'm not going to come outside or go longer than that section of the tube, because what's going to happen is eventually the loop is going to be able to slide up and down this. So I don't want the end of the loop to ever be able to slide past the cap. And I think this will be more obvious later, but for right now I guess you just have to trust me. So the next challenge is, how do I get, I just hit the move tool and I'm not seeing it because my pivot point is at 0, 0, 0. So I'm going to center the pivot here, and then I'm going to move my curve in. And you notice to the right, if you look at that bottom view, you can start to see where I am. So this curve is essentially representing the center. I want this to basically be in the center. And I'm just going to eyeball. There's probably a quantitative way to do that, but I'm just going to eyeball it. Another way I can do this to try to help myself is turn on the X-ray, and now I can see my curve. And it's a pain to keep trying to, I want to get detail at this scale here, but then the handle for moving it is way up higher, right? So I hold down the letter D so I can move the pivot point, letter C, snap to curve, and middle mouse drag, I'm bringing the pivot point now right down there. So I want to make sure I can see. Here's what I was talking about in terms of the quantitative analysis. I know this polygon right here, it's a 6-sided polygon, so even when it's smooth like this, I know this set of edges represents the middle of it. So I can stay right there from the front view and know I'm pretty much aligned from the front. Now if I change my orthographic view here to side and hit F to frame the current selection and then scale up and turn on the X-ray here as well. Let's turn the lighting to default and let's make a X-ray and let's use default materials. These are all little steps I'm doing just to, and let's show wireframe unshaded. So doing these things is just to help guide me. So I can see I'm pretty much in the middle here too from the side view, so that's great. Okay, so that curve is going to be where I want it to be. All right, and you know, at this point the curve isn't attached to anything, it's just floating there. So if you want to, you could, you know, grab a CV and even move it just a little further up just to give the curve more depth, to make sure you can hide the loop when it's ready in there. Okay, so I'll go back to object mode. I still have my curve selected, and what I want to do is basically use the same rig that I did to control the flexible portion of the scope. I want that same set of joints to control that curve I just made. So I'm going to work back to my outliner, and it's a little small for you to see probably, so let me just make this a little bigger. Okay, so I can tell right here, this is the effector, and as a result, that's telling me that's where the IK is from the first, the large curve. This is the joints from here up are controlling the majority of the scope. This is where that stomach curve is the IK being used as the IK, and these joints then from here down are now the ones controlling just the flexible portion. So I can hold down my command key on a Mac. I think it's the Alt key on a Windows machine. Select those joints. Now the problem is I forgot to do something here. What did I forget to do? Unfortunately, I got to find that curve now. So I dropped it. See if I can find the curve. All right. Okay, so now I've got the curve again. Before I can do all this, what can I do? I've got all this garbage. You know, I've got history, I've got transformations. So I'm going to edit, delete by type history, modify, freeze transformations, and I'm going to center the pivot of that curve as well, back now to the default position. Curve is still selected then. Now I'll go back into the outliner and get those joints I need. And again, I can use that effector as my landmark to know I need the joints from that point down. So I want to make sure the curve is controlled only by these joints. So it's probably a little overkill here, but what I'm going to do is in the bind skin, I'm going to say use selected joints, and I'm going to say bind skin. And now what I should be able to do is click the bend deformer, hit the letter T for the transform tool, move that handle, and I should see, so you can see the green curve. That's the curve we just made. You see how well it's now adhering to the shape of the bend deformer curve. Okay, so remember now, when we made the curve for the bottom portion of the rig, the flexible portion of the scope, we let the software make an automatic curve, so we had a straight line basically. We then put a bend deformer on that curve. So this line represents the bend deformer. There's another curve in here that represents the curve. This right here. This is the flex curve. Okay, that's the curve that's also being. That's the curve that's being modified by this bend deformer, because the curve we just created, the one that's going to create the loop, is now rigged, or skinned I should say, onto the same set of joints. It is also being controlled now by this bend deformer. So two curves both simultaneously being controlled by one bend deformer, and that's going to be a help later when we put the loop inside here. Alright, so let's see if we can get back to where we were for a second here. We'll take the bend curvature, we'll set it back to 0, so we go back to its default position. We can show the last hidden, which I believe is the scope, and again, if I modify this, you can now see the scope is still moving like it should be, so that's good. Okay, so we've got a curve now that is controlled by a set of joints that are controlled by a bend deformer via another curve. Alright, so let's see in the next lesson what do we do with that.